To introduce Fred Waugh, I'm very happy to have my colleague from the Department of English, Josephine Park.
Whoops, shouldn't have touched that. Okay, it's an honor to introduce Fred Waugh, whose significant work as a poet, editor, and teacher has made him a truly influential voice in North American poetics. His extraordinary body of work is available, as Charles mentioned last night, on the Fred Waugh Digital Archive. And as I was clicking through the alphabetized index, I discovered not only the sheer volume of work available, but you see the multiplicity of his engagements with images, places, and especially fellow artists. This online portal leads you into a world of expression, critique, and dialogue, a fitting way into the work of Fred Waugh, whose situated writing is itself a way into the world. As he wrote in a brief meditation titled From In Here, from 1976, quote, "Writing has a lot to do with place, the spiritual and spatial localities of the writer. In the particularity of a place, the writer finds revealed the correspondences of a whole world." And as I was considering Fred Waugh's 50 years of writing, as Charles pointed out last night, I turned to his beautiful 1975 volume, Pictograms from the Interior of BC. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this book. As many of you know, these poems were inspired by pictographs, Indian rock paintings, and each poem is matched to a painting. Waugh identifies these poems as transcreations, and we heard a beautiful transcreation last night of Fred Waugh's, carrying a cross of birth. And next to one especially mysterious pictograph, the brief poem almost reads, "Invisible Trick," except all the eyes in the two words are missing. These missing eyes, of course, play with the eye that can't see the invisible trick, and upon reading the poem, we see the pictograph anew as a magician vanishing into the rock. This particular trick of disappearing into the interior to show us a magical space is characteristic of Fred Waugh's poetry, which takes us into the trees and around the world, all transcreations which breathe again through his rhythms. Another significant interior for Fred Waugh is the Diamond Grill, the title of his award-winning 1996 book, named after his family's restaurant. Diamond Grill was, as many of you know, a meditation on the Waugh family, his mother's Swedish side, and Fred Waugh's own place in the world. At one point, he recalls that, quote, "When I was in elementary school, we had to fill out a form at the beginning of each year. The first couple of years, I was really confused. The problem was the blank after racial origin. I thought, well, this is Canada. I'll put down Canadian." For Fred Waugh, who he is derives from place, and his writing reveals the way in which the correspondences of a whole world can be discovered within Canadian interiors, whether through pictographs in BC or in the Naugahyde and Formica booths of the Diamond Grill. Please join me in welcoming Fred Waugh.
Well, thank you so much. Of course, what Josephine didn't read on that piece is that when I filled out Canadian and on grade 2 or 3 or whatever it was, and the teacher said, "Well, no, Fred, you can't be Canadian because Canadian isn't a racial identity. You're Chinese because that's what your father is. And that's what you have to put down." So that started it, and of course that that kind of interpolation.
Here she is. Second grade teacher. Leave it to Charles.
I don't know. I was debating or moving around between several things I thought I might do today, and one that I kind of really wanted to do was what I'm working on a blog, just because I find the blog writing kind of curious and interesting. It's a form of composition, but and it's mostly around dementia, because my mother, who's 94, is going through dementia, and I'm fascinated by what some of the dynamics of what she's going through in terms of memory and language, and particularly the fact that she can't complete a sentence. So that gap at the end of the sentence, and there's been a lot of talk here this weekend, or this, not weekend, this week, these weekdays about gaps and I'm not, no, I'll just not lean on it. Just stick this cord underneath. Okay, Sarah, you're just brilliant. That's fine.
Yeah, lift up the table, and then you can...
No, that's fine. It's fine, Bob. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay.
That's fine. Anyway, so that's one of the things I'm not going to do is talk a little bit about some of the things that have to do with memory and the loss of memory, or the end of the sentence, the incomplete sentence, and so forth. And and then one of the things I really thought I would do, and I pulled out of that one, was Louis Cabri edited, as I said last night, a selection of my poetry. And as many of you here know Louis, because he was in Philly, and he's excruciatingly intense and patient about what he does. And so he wrote a beautiful essay to the thing, but we had a discussion, which is published at the end of the book. And I was going to just simply read that because I thought Louis' interrogation of Waugh's work was really quite interesting. But that's in the book, and you can look at that. So, and I thought, as Charles has so eloquently reminded you, I'm quite old, and my mind is mush. So I'm just going to use a piece that I thought. I had a piece that I did last year in Lisbon, in Portugal. So this is was written for a kind of Portuguese audience. But at the same time, I think it's worth reading here because I certainly couldn't. I don't think I could read this in Canada. They wouldn't be that interested in Canada in me talking about Canada. So because we're in the United States of America, I thought I'd try this. This is. The conference was called From Sea to Sea. From Sea to Sea represents an imago mundi, if you've read Charles Olson, that has defined Canada's national consciousness from the last spike to the present. It has served to hegemonically override a range of prepositional possibilities that poetry and poetics in our time has used to relocate a citizen imagination. In much the same way Fernando Pessoa played out Portugalization by reciting the heteronymic constituents of nation, Canadians have been forced to perform themselves through a metaphor of nationhood signed by coercive mottos, coats of arms, flags, animals, and other symbols. This essay seeks out a cultural lexicon not to do with the abstract patriotism framed by two or three oceans. From sea to sea to sea is really what it ends up becoming, but by going to the minute and particular initiated by those two prepositions in the motto, from and to. I propose that the prepositions clinging to Canada's slogan, From Sea to Sea, are truer testimony to the experiential condition of that biblical saying than the national imaginary, the Canadaization it usually represents to its citizens and the world. I'm going to skip through here some stuff. I know there are some mixed metaphors here, but I'm speaking primarily from a mixed, i.e. hybridized position, informed by many years of trying to articulate my own mixed racialization. My interest in what I've called an alien ethnic poetics, half-bred poetics, and hyphenated poetics have helped me pay attention to some of the background noise in language that is frequently made transparent by the tyranny of form and ideology. So it seems natural, given this motto, to recognize that prepositions in From Sea to Sea might also be read as locating a time and space outside and between what is signified on the surface. And I must say, I just acknowledge George Oppin's use of the minute here, which has been very influential in my writing. Prepositions and other little tool words like adverbs and conjunctions are a kind of grammatical GPS. We've even tried to rule on their betweenness function. Never end a sentence with a preposition. But where's that rule at? The preposition from that opens the motto is the site of a constructive tension, a paradox of intention and coercion. The intention, of course, is that from sea to sea would make a place where its citizens would be free from the departures, separations, avoidances, and differences of those source nations from which its citizens originated. But the coercion in our motto is using from in a negative and confining role. If you say you're from Canada, no, where are you from? Really from? Just broke that rule again. So that, in a very real sense, to be from Canada is also to not be from Canada. The tension involved by this paradox continues to generate a prepositional reality that forces the citizen self to constantly juggle public attention. I come from the sea, across the sea, just across from here, from another place, far from here. And from what I've been told, the ships sailed from Norway, Spain, China, in other words, from nations from which the we thought it should become a nation too, as if it was from some form of dictation from on high, say like from Psalm 72:8, from which nation is translated from dominion, rule, kingdom, and from other potentials for coercion analysis like the immigration officer blocked the citizen from returning to her own country. So the preposition from can team up with barrier verbs. If you ban X from doing Y, then Y did not happen. That kind of thinking is useful when they want to keep people away from here, like refugees from different places who are always suspect from the color of their skin, and from is also useful for collecting taxes and for taking away from the citizen her rights. And if you're from there, you're not here. So try to keep from shaking and don't stop yourself from running away from here to kingdom come. The preposition to underlines a very nominal role in that it's like an arrow to place and name. This prepositional to is very minute and cellular in its particularity, in its use of specificity. The connection here to story, history, and histology, the study of cells, is dynamic and attractive to the poetic imagination. To his parents, he wrote that he went to the Philippines. Too far away, they thought. Too good a lie to pass up, to hide from too much family. But really, he went to Victoria on Hong Kong Island and then to Victoria on Vancouver Island. Islands are too small for big ideas. Then right away to Vancouver to work as a cook on the spur lines that shuttled out to a lot of small towns on the prairies. Too flat. After 5 years, he went back to China to get a wife, but when he returned to Canada, the head tax was too much to bring his family to Swift Current. Too difficult, too cold, too white. Then he got married to a white woman, to the cashier in his cafe. And for a few years they moved to Medicine Hat, but that was too small, so they returned to Speedy Creek and stayed there through the Depression and the war. Too sad, too poor. Well, after World War I, her parents moved to Göteborg and took the boat to Halifax and then to Saskatchewan and to her grandfather's farm. But by the time she was in school, they had moved to Swift Current, to the middle of that mass of Pleistocene sediment, plate, wedge, arrow, sky, beak, horizon, and that's where they met, and then moved to Trail, and then to Nelson, where I met you, and then we were on the move too, but always come back to where we are, or supposed to be. Bonavista to Vancouver Island, Arctic Circle to the Great Lakes waters, this land to you and me. The homophone of to is too attractive to resist. A lovely slip of one's letters' sound and attention to modify and open up another space. Not the to as more, but the to as part of, inclusive. So this adverbial adjectival shift seems useful in how it might suggest another kind of location. Also, not a prepositional, but an adverbial, but still positional, the way I use it in a piece called Me Too, as a post-positional locator. So that explains the only image I'm able to show, or going to show here. In February 2004, I was at the Walter Phillips Gallery in Banff, looking at a show of Roy Keoka's photos. Roy Keoka is a Canadian artist and writer who's now passed away. looking at a show of Roy Kyoka's photos, videos, and soundscapes titled Accidental Tourist, a show that foregrounded for me the diaristic in his art. Many of his phototext projects resonate with the Utaniki, the poetic diary. Walking around the show, I accidentally passed between one of the slide projectors and the carousel of images projected on the wall. My shadow is cast into the image on the wall, and I have the strange sensation that old friend and artist Roy Kyoka is taking a posthumous photo of me, framed in a familiar landscape from within the darkness of a stairwell on Hastings Street in Vancouver around 1979. That little adverbial accident in experiencing Kyoka's show by seeing myself between the projector's light and Kyoka's photograph opened up the positionality of hybridity that has become so important to any articulation of race, ethnicity, and culture. How to occupy that site of betweenness without dramatizing and privileging the polarities of dominance and homogeneity is the problem I keep trying to answer in my writing. The poem ends by pointing to the hyphen. The trait d'union has a specific cipher to hang on to. Me too feels like some small cry from way back when. My own too facile digital photos now insert a self into the preemptive silences of a past that reiterates an amongness, a betweenness that has always been that me. Caught the shadow puppet of my former self, not all there, accidental, not occidental, tourist, an old story. Between us and I calls out to include myself in the light and to stay right there, don't move, before it is claimed by the shudder of repetition. Both lie recumbent in a me that riddles our solicitudes. Me too, then, 3, then 4, more than another someone else on Hastings Street, on Hastings Trait d'Union. This is a useful segue to Discount Me In, which is actually on Penn Sound, which did for Charles last spring. So there's it's a series of poems that came out of a conference much like this, actually. So it's a series called Discount Me In that is published in a book, Isidore, which they have out here, to perhaps illuminate this site of betweenness as a dialectic that is constitutive. How do you say that? Constitutive. Constitutive? Okay. Constitutive and generative in its recognition of a kind of ambiguity of agency, Judith Butler would say, confronted within the creative and the critical, the social and the political. Some of the fodder for this piece is provided by 2 recent essays on poetics that posit conceptual approaches to the notion of the linguistic turn, or the turn to language. Michael Davidson's essay, The Dream of a Public Language, Modernity Manifesto and the Citizen Subject, in a recent issue of XCP, Cross-Cultural Poetics, edited by Mark Novak in 2007, questions both the linguistic turn, quote, that it locates identity within a common language, unquote. The example he uses is Adrian Rich's Dream of a Common Language, speaking of Adrian Rich, that thematizes the problem of identity and agency, and the linguistic turn of language poetries that configures the social within the matrix of signifying systems. Instead, Davidson suggests instances of public language that offer tentative interventions into the power grid. The spaces of global amalgamation and production offer the possibility of a public language that speaks out not only across borders but on the border, not through the author but through authors produced in acts of reading and interpretation. Jeff Dirkson's introduction to a recent issue of West Coast Line, which was, I think, about 2006, 7, somewhere around there, edited by him, called Poetry and the Long Neoliberal Moment, offers further pertinent and useful readings on the question of the linguistic turn in cultural theory and its implication for globalization and poetics. Like Davidson, he argues for a turn to language that designates the site of intervention. what he calls poetics that points to the gap between the language and promises of neoliberalism, a poetics that reaches down to the sign as a contested and productive arena, and a poetics that reaches up to grasp the vectors of contradictions and the global local logics that define neoliberalism. I've used their essays to get at, or to get back at, some hunches I have about betweenness. And there are a couple of poems in that series which mention that context here, but I'm not going to read those. But that hunch I have is the hyphen as a site of intervention, the gap as a space in which to generate the news and contest the manipulation of power and information by the state. I used the title of that conference, too, to improvise around notions of identity and location. So I'd like to foreground a few of the poems that morphed out of that title. Count, 1947. 1947 was also the year that the Chinese Exclusion Act was lifted. Well, this was a major step. It didn't mean the gates were wide open for Chinese immigrants. At first, it was really only the wives of Canadian citizens and unmarried children under the age of 18 who were added to the list of admissible Chinese immigrants. It wasn't until 1967 that Chinese immigrants were admitted under the same criteria as people of other origin. Prior to 1947, the right to vote federally had been denied to all Asians in Canada, which included Chinese, Japanese, and Indian, South Asian Canadians. Both Chinese and Indian Canadians were allowed to vote by 1947, and by 1948, Japanese Canadians had the right to vote in federal elections. And by the way, our First Nations did not have the right to vote until 1961. So in that census, I could finally be counted in. Trust me, I was somewhere else. In 1947, I don't think I was counted. I must have been Chinese. From the summit of myself, I was on the other side, part of an exclusion act. Wonder if the census counted my mother as another Swedish ghost, my half-self, already paying down the social insurance number so hard to remember. Just look it up. Again and again, the numbers get jammed. The lock tumbled into the Family Universe Index. I didn't know where I was, always ending up somewhere else, floated over Saskatchewan west with the vote, a British Columbian subject, still living outside of the state, unaccountable since birth. I keep looking for a signifier to cling to. These days, iteration might not find me home, except it's late, and I want to play my part post-immigration. The shadows of numbers to include the click-clack of mahjong above Pender, casinos of NAFTA still bussing the loot 24 hours a day to International Village. Global count, a digital Olympics, so you can trust me, I'm usually somewhere else. The census catches up, and so does the vote to be counted and be caught. Me, 1892. In my thinking through writing, I've tried to shift the me as ego and self outside the self. Until Mary McNutter calls me a chink, I'm not one. I didn't know I was a chink. But she helped out. She figured it out. This offers a site of uncertain ambivalence. The name's usually what we go by, but is also complicated by that Althusserian notion of interpolation. Charlie Chim Chong say Wong Lung Chung, John, no Jim, he says, first to remember Henry and his dad walking down Granville Street, first heard of Genghis Khan. You remember, that'd make the grandfather, a son called Quan Fu Li. That is Jim, says, you know Quan Yu of Epic San Quo. I tell Dr. Ong, not Ma, my dad was really soon. Remember nothing, immigration man. Across the table you may sit, and make the name a mind, a stamp upon these disappearing slanted eyes, no Charlie left to Chan, the movie or the memory find. Your name is my name, our name, leftover slash of bones alone, leftover commander, front to back, after sign in Chinatown, slowly call again, he spell me off. He sigh him as a middle name, official smile, hey, you, who, me? The thing with the name Wah comes from, and there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Wahs given that surname as they came across the immigration officer who couldn't understand, who didn't realize that the Wah at the end of the name was really the first name. So When I first saw Vancouver Chinatown in the 50s, I thought, wow, we got a lot of relatives. In 1923, read the Chinese Exclusion Act, and there's an internet reference here, but in 1923, the federal government brought in an act that I think we ended up calling it the Chinese Exclusion Act. I don't think it is called officially that, but it was specifically aimed at keeping Chinese out of the country, not other Asians, by the way, at that time. But they had been trying for years. In fact, they raised the head tax in 1904 or 1902, just before my grandfather had tried to return to Canada from China, and it was too much. He couldn't bring his family with him because the head tax was so high. So they had been trying for years to kind of keep them out now that they had built the railroad. In hum, humiliation, hum, however, hum, heavy birthday, dominion, hum, accept, hum, libre, liberalize, hum, hefty head tax, hum, go back where you came from, hum, the axe, hum, immigration, hum, exclusion, hum, citizenship, hum, enemy alien, hum, Kamagata-Maru, hum, subject, British, hum, citizen white, no yellow, hum, cheap labor, hum, husbands and fathers, hum, X and X, taboo, the tea girl in your cafe, hum, however waves and waves, hum, horde, hum, yellow peril, hum, white sugar, hum, white blue collar, but include within the hum and in the shout of out. Salves, 15th century. This is a turn to language, so maybe we might use another measure of length, thinking of the long neoliberal moment, the shift in the value of long vowels, the great vowel shift. Selves is a plural noun dormant within the outside, though it is not a pronoun, so when I chatter, we don't get colder. It tricks language into an intense recitation of I, we, as a way to keep warm around the pockmarked tongues of other selves. A translation of winter that comes after winter, left holding the math of multiple history. Just like Lorca's ghosts, the frogs of South America are wide awake. See, this is how difficult post-hibernation gets when plurality reveals its linguistic DNA, when the great vowels shift and all the pronouns splash into the pond like single green needles. Shiver under the perfect presence of after. And there was a colon. The colon in the title, count me in, writing public salves, acts almost prepositionally. If we look closely, we might find some way to disperse the dominance of polarity around the hyphen. The hyphens always seems to, operate in a kind of polarized way. You only think of, like, I'm Chinese Canadian, but you only think of Chinese and Canadian, and I'm neither. For most of us in the hyphens, whatever hyphen that might be, the polarity is problematic. It's always shifting off. Between you and me there is an I, 2007. Between two stools the hyphen lies, the eggs and the nest, the blind and the fold, the hinge of the city, the door and the jam, the map and its edges, the wars I've not fought, the life and its lease, the rope at which end, the brink and disaster, the bank and the laughter, the spike below Chinaman's Peak, that spot where the two rails meet. From between two stools, hear the silence rise, the smoke round your neck, the tongue and the dash, the cat and the cradle, the dog dead in the creek, the slash and the burn, the shadows of NAFTA, the head and the tax, rock, bluff and river, the laundry its mark, the height and the trestle, kata and strophe, not caboose, but what's after. So it goes on, actually the paper goes on to, it plays around with a bunch of translations. There's a hyphen in there, which you can't hear. Same problem as Jordan was talking about. But I did a bunch of translations of Pessoa, and his his work at that. But what I want to just, if I could use a few more minutes, what I'd like to do is take this opportunity, because I wasn't here on December the 6th when Charles and Rachel and Bob and others were here presenting their thing on 1960. And Al Filreis said, and I talked a little bit, and I loved the event. I thought it was a wonderful event. I don't know if any of you, it's still available. You can bring it up on, what's not Penn Sound, but I don't know what it is. It Penn Sound? Okay, it's a video. You can watch the whole thing or listen to the whole thing. And they're wonderful. There's a whole series of wonderful papers on texts from 1960. I watched it sitting out there in my little study in Vancouver, and I felt that it was a little too Eastern. I thought a lot about, and of course I had been talking to Al about a text that I thought was very important, at least around 1960, and it certainly was important to Ed Dorn, and that was his first book, The Newly Fallen, published by Leroy Jones, Totem Press, in January 1961, but Leroy had it in his hands December the 18th, 1960. So I'm kind of claiming that for Dorn. But I'd like to insert Dorn's first book into that symposium to address an element I felt missing in the original presentation of texts. Senses of space seemed crucial to the new news about poetry I encountered at age 21, living in Vancouver and having grown up in the Kootenay Mountains in the southeast of British Columbia. The New American Poetry anthology tapped into a need to identify the local that was just blossoming in the Northwest and was of great interest to us Canadian post-colonials. Olson's poetic mapping of Gloucester was as overwhelming as our concurrent discovery of William Carlos Williams's Patterson. But younger and more Western poets like Dorn, Whalen, and Snyder suggested a geographically closer to home and local flavor. Gary Snyder's poem Rip Rap in the Al Anthology was, for me, a gem of affirmation, a poem about the kind of work I had done in the bush, working on trails, in the kind of place I came from. The home of my mind seemed eligible for the world of the poem. The Newly Fallen was published by Leroy Jones's Totem Press in January 1961, just before Dorn turned 32. I think his birthday was in February, but it represents the initial staging of Dorn's work, and it seems from the correspondence between Jones and Dorn, which has been collected by Emil Elkley in a project from CUNY that's worth looking at. Where was I here? And it seems from the correspondence between Jones and Dorn that Jones had the manuscript in hand by December the 8th. Well, I've got here December 30th. Black Mountain, Cohort, Fielding Dawson did the cover for the book, and his drawing plays off of the book's title, in turn the last line of the book. And the drawing that Fielding supplied is of an aerial contraption used for transporting manure on a farm. And it's a kind of wonderful cover, very impressive. And I can't recall why I know that it's about that, but Fee told me, or Dorn, somebody told me. Anyway, Dorn had been living in the Pacific Northwest since the mid-50s, the setting for his autobiographical novel By the Sound, and was in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1959-60, in the midst of a poetic community that included Creeley, Max Finstein, and Judson Cruz. Gil Sorrentino and Allen Ginsberg were visitors. He had been published in Paul Carroll's Big Table, courtesy of a push from Creeley, the Evergreen Review, John Wiener's Measure, Migrant, Arc 2, Moby 1, and had work solicited by Jones for Eugen. A 22-year-old Tom Rayworth in Britain had just started publishing Outburst and solicited poems from Dorn in late 1960. 1960 was just post-Cuban Missile Crisis and very much in the era of a lot of nuclear bravado. That year, Leroy Jones traveled to Cuba to met with Castro and published Cuba Libre in Evergreen Review. By 1960, living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the middle of the continent, in the middle of the central fact to to man born in America, space, Olson's Call Me Ishmael, Dorn depends on the shared poetic interest of an expansive community of writers from New York to San Francisco. He accepted a teaching job at Idaho State in Pocatello in 1961, where he wrote his stunning journey poem, Idaho Out, which I first heard in February 1962 when Creeley, who taught at the University of British Columbia that year, brought Dorn to Vancouver for a reading. I was enthralled by a poetry that foregrounded place and class and fleshed out a range of attention to the local, the sensuous and the political and the national that I could feel somewhat at home with. Soon after, I managed to pick up a copy of The Newly Fallen for 70 cents. Dorn tells Jones that his selection for the manuscript will be earlier works. None of the things that were in Don Allen's anthology, but scattered magazine pieces. And he tells Jones, the chore of selecting from my own work will be a headache. The selection seems a little tentative, considering the more specifically Western poems in the next book, Hands Up. A few of the poems incline to an easy kind of lyricism, but more generally, they move through what he calls the great geography of my lunacy. A range of love song, the domesticity and furnishings of what he saw as Williams's grand commonplace, some biotextual references to growing up in Midwest Americanism, farm stuff, Illinois, Sousa, etc. The collection contains no grand address to the geographical, but a number of inclinations that a little later in something like Idaho Out shape Dorn's ambivalent tension between the freedom implicit in Olson's capitalized and open space and the West and Dorn's sense of the West as a site of poverty and estrangement. Mad elements to be scrutinized, he said. And an uncollected poem, The Mountains, likely written in 1960 in Santa Fe, ends with the lines, there is no coming back from the space you make. A rather sardonic ambiguity so characteristic of Dorn's view of space. The poems in The Newly Fallen intuit his impending observation that the outsider, the stranger in town, is the one to pay attention to. He's the one who knows where he's come from, Dorn tells us in the poet, The People and the Spirit. Or maybe not. He says in a poem, Geranium, I go on my way, frowning at novelty, wishing I were closer to home than I am. And this is the last stop before Burlington, that peace center which is my home, but not the home of my mind, that asylum I carry in my insane squint. Along with the poems in the Allen anthology, The Newly Fallen signals Dorn's presence in the 1960 roll call of New American Poetry. So there, I got it inserted. Thank you. Thank you, Jordan. Oh, it's not there. Oh, it's here.
So, any questions? I have.
Hi, I'm Fred. Well, thanks a lot for that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the hyphen, specifically at the end of Diamond Grill. You have that really excellent passage where you're trying to get a visa to go to Buffalo to study, right? Mm-hmm. And it's that moment where the one side of you is not able to get this visa, so you have to go down there and somehow negotiate, and you're involved in this questioning. So I was wondering if you can talk about that piece and maybe talk a little bit more about how you've been negotiating that Mr. In Between throughout your poetic practice.
Well, I'll read the piece because I've got a copy of Diamond Grill right here, but it wasn't for some reason published in the first edition of Diamond Grill. So So they published it in the second edition. Vancouver, British Columbia, 1963. Hello, is this the U.S. consulate? I'm calling about getting a visa. I'm going to Albuquerque as a graduate student, but I'd like to be able to work in the States. What's your name? Wah, W-A-H, Fred Wah. Is that a Chinese name? Yes, it is. Why? I'm afraid you'll have to apply under the Asian quota, sir, and there's a backup of several years on the Asian list. But I'm a Canadian. I'm afraid that doesn't matter. If you're of Chinese origin, even if you're born in Canada, you still have to go under the Asian quota. Well, that's ridiculous. Could I come down and talk to the Consul General about this? By all means, but he's busy. I'll be right down. Fast over False Creek, down Burrard to Georgia, downtown. And what can I do for you, sir? My name's Fred Wah. I talked with the receptionist on the phone this morning about getting a visa. She told me that even though I'm a Canadian, because my racial origin is Chinese, I'll have to apply under the Asian quota. But you don't look Chinese. That's because I'm half Swedish. I'm only quarter Chinese. Well, that makes all the difference then. If you're less than 50%, you can enter the U.S. as a Canadian. Just ask the girl out front for the forms. It shouldn't take more than a few days. You had me fooled there. I don't know what that has to do with a hyphen, Jordan.
Well, I think it's a point that you have used it to your advantage in a way, right? That on the phone.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
right. Sort of the going back and forth, right?
Yeah, frankly, I hadn't paid much attention in growing up and living in BC, going to school in Vancouver. I hadn't paid much attention to like the blood percentages, where I was in all that. I just, it was a kind of something I could be ignore in a way. And it was that 50% thing he said to me or she said to me that kind of shook me up a little bit. I had a friend, Wei-Sun Choi, Sonny Choi, who's since written about it, but he wasn't allowed into the States that year because he was full-blooded. He was real Chinese, which wasn't at that time a laughing matter because Sonny was a fantastic theater student, but he couldn't get in. But it then, of course, became not so much in the States, because I was going to the States, and I followed Bob Creeley to Albuquerque, and then I moved up to Buffalo for a few years, and I didn't run into that really as any kind of problem there. It really wasn't, the whole address to race in Canada, at least for me, in my experience, wasn't even available until the late 70s. Race wasn't even a term. They went through a whole thing about ethnicity, and we didn't have that, the Black American dynamic in Canada that had been going on in the States, although we were certainly paying attention to it and certain aspects of it. But it wasn't until, let's say, Joy Kagawa's novel Obasan was published in 1976, and that whole push towards first there was biculturalism or bilingualism. Right. Remember the B&B Commission, French and English. Okay, well they're going to get French and English, but nothing else. And then and then it became multi, and then the Japanese redress movement started in 1979. And the 80s were really a time of developing a discourse around race, in which I had to, which I entered, I willingly entered, but which I had to kind of find some space to speak for myself, and because it was, frankly, there were a lot of purities that were appropriating that discourse that kind of created a kind of ambivalence in me about where I was in all that. And it's been really productive to have to go through that. So I guess we should thank that American consulate in Vancouver. Wow, yeah, we'll let you in.
And here she is.
Hi, Fred.
Hi, Jeff.
I'm interested in the kind of movement of, just to follow up on this kind of hyphen migration, the movement of the hyphen from avant-garde to Asian Canadian. Because there's points where you were seen as an avant-garde writer, which in some ways seemed to negate the possibility of being seen as an Asian Canadian writer. And I just wonder if that discourse of race that rose so forcefully in the 80s, which was part of a cultural front in Canada that had an immense social effect, as you were pointing out, just wondering if the entry into that discourse also allowed you to enter into a space of being seen as a North American Asian avant-garde writer, in a sense that these two discourses that were once kept separate are able to become understood more fully as outside of the national boundary and outside of some of these other hyphenations that are going on.
That was problematic. Personally, in a sense, problematic with the community of writers that I had sort of hung around with in a way. I remember Bowring saying, oh, wow, you can't get on the race wagon. What's that all about? And it became a problem also in that those communities that came together around racial politics, the racialization in the 80s. And in fact, it wasn't until Walter Lew published an anthology called Premonitions from Kaya Press in New York. And one thing Walter did was he insisted it be North American Asian, not just Asian American or whatever. So he kind of broke that down. And he included myself and Roy Kyoka and who? Roy Miki. I don't know who else is there. Lau. What's her name? Evelyn Lau. I don't know. There were a number of Asian Canadians are in there as well. And it wasn't until Walter did that, which I don't think that anthology came out until late 80s, early 90s, that and Walter very nicely situates a kind of, if you like, avant-garde. His sense of avant-garde writing within the Asian community, North American Asian community, was pretty accurate and refreshing. And I don't know, I've got such a wonderful community of friends and everywhere that problem that I encountered in 1980, hasn't really been a problem. In fact, I really want to credit feminist poetics, and particularly Nicole's work in the 70s for me, which were really influential in helping me. By the time I had to start negotiating a kind of racial aesthetics, if you want to call it that, or how do I operate? How does my poetry operate in this discourse? I had a lot of tools. I had a lot of sensibility about language, so I was able to use language as a way to move into it. And as several other writers, a few other writers were. And Jeff Durkin has written an essay about this, so he's asking that question tongue in cheek.
Thank you very much for the talk, Fred. I thought I'd continue the hyphen migration questioning. We've traced it between Chinese Canadian or Asian Canadian avant-garde, and you mentioned yourself translation with the hyphen in there. And I'm a little bit curious to know more in this way. The other one seemed like things that are labels applied to, whereas with translation, that's perhaps a willful claim or space that you choose to go to. So I'm curious about the shift there, the reclamation of that hyphen, that I don't know, that it's almost like a divisive but also a connective tissue. And do you have a sense of the claiming that went along with the use of that punctuation?
In terms of translation, do you mean?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I think as most writers here would acknowledge, translation, or the act of as a compositional tool, is fascinating, and we use it to varying degrees. And of course, the whole debate around translating, target to source to target language is always a problem. But thanks to people like Aaron Moray, who has sort of opened that up, cracked that open, and a number of other translators, she calls them, that's been opened up. But the fact that it's whether the hyphen is apparent or transparent is important, I think. And so I know after the Japanese-Canadian redress, the Japanese-Canadian community actually said they don't want the hyphen in there. They took the hyphen out. It's going to be Japanese blank space Canadian, because they thought the hyphen was too much of a claim. What, pardon? But they, that so, and I want that reminder. I want that cipher, that little spike, as a reminder that that space needs to be paid attention to, no matter whether it's a gap or a blank or whatever. But it is a space that is very real and rife with potency. And I guess I first ran across this problem when I translated, when I transcreated Indian rock paintings, or the pictograms from the interior of BC, and Steve McCaffrey kind of tried to call me, or called me on this, how I was positioning myself in relation to this thing. And these were not, he wasn't worried about them being translations, but he was worrying about the fact that I was taking images and whether or not they were simply adornments to the poem, or the poem. In any case, I ran into that problem in 1976 in trying to work with Lake Salish pictograms, of which there was no documentation, so it was totally open, if you like, to the imagination. And I just loved that sense that, gee, things can be open, you can actually do anything you want. So, and of course in language, I think a lot of writers really enjoy the discovery of, I remember, do you mind if I tell the story about multilingualism? When I first met Nicole, she came to the Kootenays, she came to South Locan, and we had an evening together in our little house up in South Locan, and I asked Nicole to read to me in French, and this was like 1974 or something like that. It was quite a long time ago, and I was yearning. Because we're in the West, we didn't hear French. We didn't have French radio or anything, and so Nicole read to me in French, and she read a poem sequence called "Ma Continent." Ma Continent. I'm sorry. That's why she had to read it.
Which in French is, there's a mistake. It's supposed to be in the masculine form, mon continent. But I wrote the poem, ma continent, because of the Japanese word ma, which means space.
Oh God, I didn't know that. Anyway, I heard, she read this to me, and I said, gee, that's amazing. I said, I really, I think I know what that poem is saying. I think I know, I can feel that poem. I know what's going on in there. And we talked a little bit about how language can operate that way at a kind of feeling level. And Nicole left, and I was just left with this. And I had the text, right? So I ended up translating it, transcreating it, as I kind of heard it. And I knew no French, and I had been, I loved Zhukovsky's Catullus, and that I thought, gee, that's a wonderful way to play with a foreign language. And so using a kind of Zhukovskian approach to a foreign language, I did this translation. But it was a mistake. It was. The poem is a really, really serious poem about Nicole's kind of documenting early feminist lesbianism, and to have a male come in and intrude on this space was really quite harsh. And B.P. Nichols said to me at the time, because he really wanted to publish it as a little chapbook, remember, and B.P. said. He said, "Oh, I get it now. It's like if you made a homolinguistic translation of the poem about the death of my daughter." Right? His wife had just had a miscarriage, and wow, I thought it was like that. So it was a very personal thing, and so the poem has never been published. I mean, it's a personal thing. It's between Nicole and I. A few others have seen it, but it's not something we want to make public. But that experience of doing that got me really interested in that whole. In naivety, I had moved into taking that language and moving into there, and I thought, one has to be a little more careful around language, and one has to honor it more. There's a kind of.
And so, what do you think? Just from this story, just from what you just said, what do you go back and revisit your sense that you understood the poem when you heard it? That sense of sound immediacy that you felt like, I really get that poem. And then in the story you just told, like there was a fundamental non-understanding of it.
But there was another level of understanding, and actually Nicole and I talked about this, and she suggested other poems that I should perhaps be interested in working with, which I did, and then I did. They became part of a series called Music with Heart of Thinking, and the poem we read last night, Sismo, is another example of that, and I do that sometimes with Nicole's poetry. I kind of go there for some news about what's happening in the language, and I don't know French. I mean, I can go and ask someone who knows. That's not what I'm after. I'm after kind of, I don't know, what would you call it, Bob? An intuition? Something that...
Well, I guess that was the big, continent that I was descrying. I mean, somehow there is intuition and immediacy, and we certainly, after performances that we've heard here, can't discount that. And :/, there's something else entirely where you need tact, a sense of history, a sense of, what's the word that Jeff kept using today, unfreedoms.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be, which are harder to perceive with our senses because we're so inured to our unfreedom, and sometimes we can mistake sensual immediacy for freedom, but we're actually just perceiving our unfreedoms.
Mm-hmm.
If you know what I mean. So anyway, it just seems like a really fascinating, double-faceted, fascinating story that you just told. That's all. So it's not even a question.
Yeah, and I must admit I depend on Erin Morey now. She does all that work. She does all that kind of trailblazing work in that, and opens things up and plays with it, and can talk. She can actually talk about it because she knows the languages she works in. I'm just playing around, but it's serious play again, as you say, and one has to reflect on that. Fini? Thank you.